Hello and welcome to Greywolf's Electric Rustler Conversion slideshow. This is going to be a rather lengthy slideshow, but it's going to take an in-depth look at my conversion project, and hopefully it'll serve as a walkthrough for anybody else wanting to do this. There's not any pre-made kits to convert a Nitro Rusty to electric out there that I'm aware of, and there's really not too many walkthroughs of any kind out that I've seen. I've seen quite a few threads where people discuss, what they've done to convert theirs, but it's not in depth by any means. And while they might discuss a few topics of various things that they did, it's by no means complete. And several of the things that I read and actually tried didn't even work. So hopefully this will address a lot of those issues and hopefully it'll help some folks along the way that want to convert their Rusties to electric. So without further ado, let's get going. This first picture here, we're looking at what I started off with, which was a Nitro Rustler chassis and a VXL Rustler transmission, which I flipped around backwards. This whole thing started from a thread that I read in some forum. I don't even know which one it was now, where a couple of guys were talking about a couple of conversions that they did, but they didn't go into great detail. They just gave some basic ideas, and I was like, that sounds easy enough, so I'll give it a try. Well, the first thing I noticed was that the VXL transmission has a lip on the bottom of it there underneath where the motor sits. And if you look down the bottom, I had to create a couple of spacers out of 1/8 inch Lexan plastic in order to get the transmission to set level. And then I also put stampede arms on the transmission because that's what those guys said they had done. And then I had also used the transmission or the stampede tie rods there as well. And that's pretty much the way I started off. I did switch out the stock spur gear for a 76 tooth, and I also bought several different pinions. If you look on Traxxas's website, they actually list the various pinion and spur gear sizes to get the various levels of speed. They have like 5 categories, I think, where it starts out as slow as 40 plus, 35 plus miles an hour, and gets all the way up to like 70 plus miles an hour. And I basically bought all the pinions that they recommended and the 76 tooth spur gear. So basically I plan on starting out at the lowest one, which I think is a 28 tooth pinion, and I'm just going to work my way up and see what the system can handle. My eventual goal is to reach that 34 or 35 tooth pinion. I can't remember exactly which one it is now off the top of my head, but that's my eventual goal, is to get to that largest pinion for the high speed runs. Here in this picture, you're just looking at a little bit better picture of the Lexan spacers that I'd cut out for that transmission to sit on. And again, here in this picture, just another picture of the spacers themselves that I'd cut out, and the bottom of the VXL transmission. So you can kind of get an idea of what I did. I just basically cut them to shape. I made a stencil basically, and then traced it onto the Lexan and just cut it out with a Dremel. Now here in this picture, what ended up happening was, and I didn't even notice this at the time, somebody, I believe it was Dog Breath, actually pointed this out to me. When I flipped the VXL transmission around and put the spacers under it, the transmission itself was sitting level, but the angle of the arms had actually become inverted from flipping it around. According to Dog Breath, I don't have any experience in this, but according to Dog Breath, this was going to create some very funky handling characteristics. So my next mission, if you will, that I set out on was to try to find a way to keep the transmission reversed, yet get that angle of the arms back the way it should be, with the front being higher than the rear. So what I ended up coming up with after a very painstaking thought process and several trial and error attempts, I had forgotten, when I took the thing apart originally, I'd forgotten that there were already a couple of shims underneath the original transmission that angled the nitro arms up at the proper angle that they should be at. So when I stumbled across those again, I ended up taking those and incorporating them into what ended up being a variation on my spacers. Instead of a spacer, it kind of became a shimmed platform, so to speak, which you'll see pictures later on of the finished thing. This was just kind of a test run where I had put in the spacers under one piece of one sheet of the Lexan plastic spacer that I created, just to see what it would do to the angle of the arms. And it actually didn't quite bring it back to the, I think, what the natural angle of the arms is, but it got it in the ballpark. It got it back angled the way it was supposed to be. I don't think I hit quite the angle or the degree of angle that it is originally, but it's about as close as I could get it. And here we're just looking at the first stage of the shimmed platform that I created. I basically just cut a piece off of the other spacer and glued it to this one in this step. So what we're basically looking at here is the cap, so to speak, to the original square piece that I'd cut out and glued to the first layer of the spacer. This cap is angled, so it's basically like a shim. I was able to do that with a Dremel and a sanding drum. The piece was small enough that I could just kind of do it by hand and was able to keep it fairly even. My initial plan was to take both of the spacers, glue them together, and create a shim out of the entire thing. But after I got to looking at it, I basically felt like the piece was too big to be able to sand it down by hand, or even with a Dremel. I didn't feel like I was going to be able to keep the angle steady over the entire piece all the way down to the end. So this is what I ended up settling on, and you'll see this piece on the rest of it here in a minute, and you'll kind of understand more what I did.